everyone, and welcome back to the Period podcast, where we will be talking about everything to do with periods. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Duffy.
And we are your hosts.
So to start off, we wanted to do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So to begin, today we wanted to kind of provide some information around like the science of like our cycles as women and how we can kind of know our bodies better and understand the different phases of our cycles and kind of get some expert advice from from certain people. And all of today is basically for women who are regularly menstruating. It's not really we're not going to be addressing like irregular periods or late periods or, like things like that. This is kind of like an overarching, like just
general biology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so what Jasmine said, this is just going to be like the general biology, and we definitely will have a later podcast coming to you about disordered menstruation, because it is so common and we think it's like super important to address. So stay tuned for that. So a disclaimer really quickly before we get into it. We are by no means doctors. Like, we have some experience because we are female. Females, we do experience regular menstruation. So a lot of it is just our own personal knowledge, but we do have a lot of research. So we just want to give credit to where it's due. We are not doctors, we're not experts, we're not researchers. We've just used research that we have found ourselves and our personal experience.
Exactly. Menstruation, or like our periods, that like how we call them, is basically the normal vaginal bleeding that like happens to a woman's body every month. So it's called like her monthly cycle. The woman's body is so incredible that each month, if you have a regular period, our body prepares to potentially become pregnant and grow another human being. Like, okay, that's amazing. That's incredible. I think that's so
crazy to me.
Epic, right? And then another thing is like menstruation occurs when pregnancy doesn't occur. So you're pregnant or you're menstruating. You know what I mean? Which is like,
I don't know about you, but I don't know about you, but I always joke around with people. Like, when my period is like really bugging me, I'm like, bro, I just need to get pregnant. Like, at this point, like, the only way to solve this is to get pregnant.
Oh my goodness. Which is weird, right?
I know, crazy.
I get what you mean though. Basically, like to continue what I was saying, it basically menstruation occurs when pregnancy doesn't occur, right? And it's kind of like a way of our body of cleaning out our uterus and the womb lining. So menstrual discharge is made up of blood and tissue from inside of the uterus. That is not necessary when you're pregnant. So the uterus lining kind of sheds itself. And periods can start anytime, but for most girls, it starts between like the ages of 10 and 15. Periods can usually last up to like 3 to 8 days. It like really just depends. Like, and everybody I feel like has like a normal rhythm for themselves, but it's not, like from me to you, like it's different, right? Like, how long is your period usually?
9 days. Like, it never changes. It's long.
Wow. See, but like that's regular for you. For me, 5 days is regular. Like,
yeah,
in 5 days, like, sorry.
When I saw 3, I was like, bro, I'm jealous. If someone only gets their period for 3 days, like, I'm sorry, you can't even complain.
Yeah, I mean, like, it sucks for everybody, but it's also really cool. Like you said, like sometimes it's even longer, and basically your menstrual cycle is happening all the freaking time.
Yeah, I think that's what I found to be the most amazing thing is I think when I was younger, and even recently, like I used to just think, okay, like I get my period and that's it. And then I get my next period and that's it. And then I realized, no, like this menstrual cycle is constantly happening in our bodies. It's every day of our lives is part of our menstrual cycle. And so it's so important that we know what's happening at each stage in our cycle because we can better understand like everything that's happening because there's like a lot of research to show that like even the stage of your period can impact the type of like exercise that is like best for you at that point in your period. There's like research to show that. So, and we'll talk about that in our next podcast, which was going to be on sports and periods. And I'm super excited for that podcast.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the menstrual cycle itself can be split into two phases. What like there's the follicular phase, also called the proliferative phase, and then the luteal or secretory phase. And the length of your menstrual cycle is usually the number of days between the first day of your period on one cycle and then the first day of your period on your next cycle. So basically, your cycle, your menstrual cycle, is the number of days between the onset of your one period and the onset of the next month's period, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the average number of days for a cycle is 28 days, but
Yeah.
again, like that number varies from anywhere to like 25 to 30 days. And then again, we are only talking about like the norm, like what's like a healthy kind of period, even though that will look different from person to person. But typically, people who have a cycle that lasts less than 21 days are termed polymenoric. And then people who have prolonged menstrual cycles who are like greater than 35 days are termed oligomenoric. Sorry, it's a long word. And then obviously people who don't have their period are termed amenorrheic, right? So that's kind of like some of the terminology. Then this is just like an interesting fact, and I don't know if anyone ever like thinks about this because sometimes when I'm on my period, like I think to myself like, bro, I'm literally losing like 4 liters of blood like every time I'm on my period. Like it feels like you're losing so much blood. Like I'm like, how am I not dying? Like people die from gunshot wounds, but like I'm literally bleeding out of my vagina for 9 days. Like how am I not dead? It's kind of yeah. But the typical volume of blood that you lose during your period is around 30 milliliters, and any amount that's greater than 80 milliliters is like a cause for like, okay, you need to go to the doctor. So, and again, like you can kind of gauge that based on like the tampons that you go through, the pads you go through, like, and some people will have heavier periods, but typically like you're not going to lose more than 80 milliliters of blood, which when you think about it is almost a liter, which is kind of scary. It's almost a liter of blood, which is kind of scary. Yeah, I know, crazy.
We used to have a teacher in high school, and she used to tell us like, like you're not actually dying, like you're good, you're fine. Because we used to like be super dramatic about it, like we're losing so much blood, and she used to be like, no, you're literally not. Like it's. She was talking about how it's like a couple tablespoons of blood.
Yeah,
Like she was like trying to measure it in tablespoons.
it's kind of like,
That's
and that's also
it.
because it's also because of the tissue that you're losing. So you're losing tissue. So it's not necessarily all blood, even though like it might look like, you know what I mean? Like it's like, oh my gosh, I'm bleeding out. But it's like, no, sweetie. Yeah, okay.
Okay. Basically, now we're gonna get into like the more like learning about like the different phases. So your menstrual cycle is highly complex. Okay, it's very very complex, and it's controlled by different glands and hormones that are produced by these glands. The hypothalamus in the brain that causes the pituitary gland to produce certain hormones and chemicals that prompt the ovaries to kind of like produce the sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Um, our, mes- our menstrual cycles are called biofeedback systems because the action of one structure or gland impacts the behavior of all other structures and glands involved. So the four main phases that we're going to kind of cover today, and also this like varies again, like we're going to keep saying this because it's true, and we don't want anybody to feel like, you know, like that theirs is not normal. You know what I'm saying? This is just like broad strokes. So you have menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. So the first phase is menstruation. And during menstruation, like basically where you're getting rid of the thickened lining of the uterus, the endometrium, from the body through the vagina. And menstrual fluid contains blood, cells from the lining of the uterus, and mucus. The average length of a period is between 3 days and a week. So that kind of like is that part of the cycle. The next part is the follicular phase, which like Rebecca will go into.
Yeah, and just to like kind of add like the with menstruation, like a lot of research will say 3 to 5 days, and then other research says 3 to 8 days. But like in general, it's like it's kind of like again, it's different for everyone. Like, and again, like the heaviness of your bleeding will be very different for everyone. And yeah, like Chiazze said, we keep reiterating like this is like a general model. There are so many things that can go wrong. Like if you think about all the tiny things happening, there is bound to be something that can go wrong. Like it's not hard for something to go wrong because there's such delicate structures involved.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I just wanted to add something really quickly.
Yeah.
You know the thing you said about how like some are 3 to 8 days and some are just like they vary, like we found different days for everyone. And I think that also has to do with like the studies, like how many females are you including in each study, and like from which ethnicity, and like just like where, what country, what like communities, what like economic status, like everything matters. Because like
for sure.
Sorry, go on. I just wanted to say that.
No, yeah, but it's true. There's so many sides to it. Like we have to look at it from a really like broad perspective. Like like you said, like culture could play a role, your age could play a role. Like are all the girls the same age in these studies, right? Like it might be different. And yeah, there was some research that I read about how when you are at your most fertile in your life, and when you are at your most like when you're slowly reaching menopause, that is when these four phases fluctuate the most. So that would make perfect sense. And that's like a hormone thing, essentially. Yeah, so after your menstruation phase, you have your menstrual phase, you have your follicular phase. So the follicular phase begins on the first day of menstruation. So it kind of overlaps. There is overlap between these phases, which is super interesting. And it ends with ovulation. And ovulation is usually around the 14th day. And that is when an egg is released to be fertilized, to be potentially fertilized. So yeah, so it starts with the first day of menstruation and it ends with ovulation. And the follicular stage is kind of started, like the first domino that is kind of like the start of the effect is done by the hypothalamus, and that causes the pituitary gland to release FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. So each of the follicles has an immature egg within it. So usually only one follicle will mature into an egg and the rest of them will kind of die. So this can occur around day 10 of a 28-day cycle. So it's day 10 to day 14, like that's when that kind of occurs. And the growth of the follicle stimulates the lining of the uterus to thicken in preparation for possible pregnancy. And this usually occurs around mid-cycle. It's usually around 2 or so weeks before menstruation starts. So during the follicular phase, the follicle that's developing, it causes a rise in the level of estrogen that's produced in the body. And the hypothalamus, which is located in the brain, it recognizes these, like the rising levels of estrogen, and it releases a chemical called gonadotropin releasing hormone, also known as GnRH. And this hormone prompts the pituitary gland to produce raised levels of luteinizing hormone, also known as LH, and FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. So essentially, I'm going to break that down one more time quickly. So you have the hypothalamus, which is in your brain. It recognizes that there's rising levels of estrogen that occur during ovulation, and it signals, this causes a chemical signal of gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this hormone is released and it causes levels of luteinizing hormone and FSH to increase. So within like 2 days of ovulation being triggered, so ovulation is triggered by the levels of LH. So the levels of LH increase as a result of the estrogen increasing, and then ovulation is triggered. And within 2 days of this happening, the egg is then like essentially funneled or pushed into the fallopian tube towards the uterus. And this is done by waves of small hair-like projections that are called cilia, I believe. And they just like push the egg along throughout the body and into the fallopian tubes. And then it's important to recognize that the lifespan of a typical egg is only 24, like it can only survive for 24 hours unless it's fertilized by a sperm. So it only lasts for 24 hours unless a sperm fertilizes it. This is the most interesting thing. There is really only a window of like 6 days in which you can get pregnant. So yeah, isn't that crazy? So I think typically it's like the 4 or 5 days before ovulation occurs, because then the sperm will still be in your system. It's not system essentially, but like the sperm will still be there, viable. And then if you ovulate, basically 5 days before ovulation and 1 day after ovulation are the only days that you could get pregnant. So you have to have sex within those whatever days, and there has to be viable sperm. So this can also be super crucial in understanding, because if you think about it, like if you could get so good at tracking your cycle, you wouldn't even need birth control. You know, people wouldn't need to take birth control. And I understand that there's a lot of different reasons why people take birth control, and I think that's an entirely different conversation. But I think there's so much about birth control that people don't understand, and there's a lot of harmful side effects that people really don't fully like comprehend, and they don't really know what they're signing up for sometimes. And I think that if people knew that they were able to, you know, control it through just like knowing their cycle really well, and they understood it well enough, I think a lot more people would utilize that knowledge. So yeah, very interesting stuff.
Yeah. And also like another thing is like, again, like even the thing you said about like the pregnancy thing, like that would be like if you're regularly menstruating, like you know what I mean? So that's really important to make sure that you're like,
yeah.
Okay, so after ovulation, you go into the luteal phase. So during ovulation, the egg kind of bursts from its follicle, but the ruptured follicle stays on the surface of the ovary. So for the next 2-ish weeks or so, the follicle transforms into a structure known as the corpus luteum. This structure starts releasing progesterone, along with small amounts of estrogen. This combination of hormones kind of maintains the thickened lining of the uterus, waiting for the fertilized egg to kind of stick to it or like fertilize it basically. And if a fertilized egg implants, if the egg is fertilized and it implants itself into the like thickened uterus lining, it produces hormones necessary to kind of maintain the corpus luteum. It's a weird word, but I like it.
There's so much.
Even luteal phase, like I like it. It's a weird word, but like it's cool. So the corpus luteum. This includes many. This includes the human chorionic gonadotropin, so basically HCG. This hormone is detected in a urine test for pregnancy. So usually when you think you're pregnant, they can do like a urine test and blood work, so you can kind of like detect for this hormone. The corpus luteum keeps producing the raised level of progesterone that is needed to maintain the thickened lining in the uterus. So I know, oh, sorry. So if pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum withers and dies. So for whatever reason, if the lining is not thick enough, it will shed, and basically you don't have a viable pregnancy. And this will usually happen around 20 on the 22nd day in the 28-day cycle. Again, normal numbers, don't like freak out. But the drop in progesterone levels will cause the lining of the uterus to fall away, and this is known as menstruation. So the cycle will repeat itself. All of this is so crazy because if you think about it, like the chances of humans being alive, like you being able to get pregnant in that window and for it to be a viable pregnancy, that's kind of epic.
Yeah, there has to be a lot. It's kind of just crazy in general. Like for me, one of the reasons why I love science so much is just because it makes you understand how like fragile life is in general. Like if you think about the way that your heart works, if you think about the way that your reproductive system works, there are a billion cajillion things that could literally go wrong. One thing being out of place could make everything go wrong. One
Literally.
hormone not being produced enough could make everything go wrong. So it is literally incredible that make things go right. Like
Exactly.
it's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Another
So
thing about these phases that I kind of wanted to mention was like, I don't know about you or like if you've ever had this, but like for myself, sorry, for myself, basically like if I'm stressed out or I'm not feeling good, not feeling good, not feeling good, like if I'm like actually stressed out, like sometimes there are like weeks where I'm stressed out about school or weeks that I'm stressed out about something else, right? So those weeks heavily influence my period, and I've skipped maybe like 2 periods in my entire life, and those were like times where I was like super stressed about school. Like it's just like, and then you get scared because you're like, what? But then like it's not pregnancy, but like, do you know what I mean? It's just like so many things can go wrong, like you said, but it's like it's normal. Do you know what I mean? Like it changes throughout your life.
I think it's really important to recognize that, there's a lot of things that could impact your cycle. Like there's so many things. So I think that's so important. I think that's a reason why it's so important to track your cycle and be aware of it, because then you can kind of be able to see like, okay, this is a thing that, it goes wrong quite often. Maybe I should get that checked out, or maybe I should figure out why it's like that. So, maybe I should learn how to cope with my stress better because my period is constantly a week late. Maybe I should figure out why. So yeah, it's definitely very valuable information. If you think about it, our body really does always tell us what's wrong. Like our body has so many ways of telling us like, hey, take care of me. Like, hey, you need to do this. And we just ignore that most of the time. And a lot of the reason why we ignore it when it comes to periods is because of the stigma. And again, like we said in our intro, like this is kind of like a reason why we wanted to do this podcast, is because we don't want that stigma there. It shouldn't be abnormal or weird for a girl to go to the doctor and be like, hey, like I need help with this. Like this is not, like this is not normal. Like
to
it's
be
not
taken seriously. Like,
exactly. Yeah. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is actually like super interesting, and I think it's super important. One quick note before that is I just wanted to quickly touch upon this because we didn't really mention a lot about it, but discharge, vaginal discharge is completely normal. And at different stages in your cycle, you will have different vaginal discharge. So learning how to read your discharge, as weird as that might sound, is super healthy and is something that you should probably think about doing as you get older and as you start to understand. it's something that you could do easily, and yeah, it will provide you with a lot of information. And just a quick little plug, this isn't sponsored at all or anything, but Flow is a great app. I use it, and I think Jasmine uses it too. Yeah, it's a cute little
I don't
app.
think it's gonna focus, but how about this? Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
and we
free.
can link it in the bio. But yeah, it's a great app, and it's pretty accurate. If you accurately input your information, it's really accurate, and it can show you how regular you are or how irregular you are. You can count the days between your cycle. You can put
It
your
also asks
symptoms in.
you, it asks you about like how long does your period usually last, and that it uses that to predict your next one. Because like Rebecca said in the and like previously she talked about how like your period starts from the day you start your period to the next time you start your period. So basically it uses that to kind of calculate and figure out when your next period is. And honestly, it's so good because like I know like if I'm stressed out and like that it's gonna be period week, like I know like to manage myself better, or like just to like prepare more,
Yeah.
Sorry, I totally cut you
And
off. But like
no worries at all. And one thing that's going to lead into my next topic, the inputting of your symptoms. So I know for me, I have very constant typical symptoms that I have, and I experience them, usually a week or two or a few days before my period happens. And I've got into a phase now in my life where I'm pretty good at reading my symptoms. And, if I am experiencing certain ones, I'm like, oh, maybe that's my period. And then that can help me to, adjust whatever I need to adjust and kind of just, be more aware of it. And it helps me to deal with a lot of things in my life. So PMS is what I'm going to be talking about. And PMS is basically, it's technically a disorder, but it's something that a lot of people have. And sorry, cut. Let me reset that.
do you
One,
want to say like the
two.
thing?
1, 2, 3. Okay, so the next topic that I'm going to be talking about is PMS. PMS stands for pre-menstruation symptoms. And this can lead to, a diagnostic, which is in the DSM. And it's called, it used to be called late luteal phase dysphoric disorder, but it's now called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD. And basically the diagnosis of PMDD is like, it's like for people who have a very specific premenstruation symptoms, and they have to like fulfill a certain amount of them and whatever. And if they do, then it's actually classified as a disorder. So some of the symptoms that you have to have are the presence of at least 5 luteal phase symptoms. So for example, mood symptoms, like for example, depression or anxiety or tension, things like that. And then you also need to have 2 cycles worth of daily charting to confirm the timing of symptoms so that they can directly link it to that. You have to have evidence of functional impairment, and the symptoms can't be exacerbating another psychiatric condition. So you can't have a previous psychiatric condition. So there are very, very strict guidelines to be diagnosed with PMDD. And that can be scary because sometimes it puts down PMS. So some of the research shows that, most women suffer from PMS. And, that includes symptoms such as, mood changes, you feel stressed, apathetic, things like that. And most women also do suffer from physical symptoms like backaches or swelling of their breasts, tenderness of their breasts, like things like that. Most women do suffer from them, and I'm like, I don't know about you, but I suffer from a ton of them. Like I'm like, bro, somebody diagnosed me with PMDD because there's something wrong with PMS. No, so yeah, so PMS definitely a very real thing. Research shows that women who have PMS um, are at a higher risk for anxiety disorders. So to me, that's so important because I feel like anxiety is something that a lot of people struggle with on a daily basis. And again, that's another condition where there's so much stigma attached to it, and there shouldn't be. So I think it's super interesting. Research is showing that anxiety disorders occur at higher rates in women who experience PMS. And if all women experience PMS, or, you know, 85% of women experience PMS, then that means that a lot of them are at risk for, things like panic disorders and stuff like that. And I think that's super important to understand and really acknowledge, because that can cause so much increased risk to these women, that's unnecessary and often sometimes avoidable. So again, like, this kind of just ties back in, but really, like, learning how to track your cycle and understand your premenstrual symptoms, I think, is super important. And if you notice that you are suffering from depression or anxiety on a regular basis, in relation to your period, don't ever be ashamed to reach out for help. Don't ever be ashamed to go, and ask someone, because there might be something severely wrong, and there's no help in ignoring that. So I think that's super
Mm-hmm.
important to acknowledge.
I agree.
And yeah, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add, Jasmine.
Um, I did have something like literally right here, and then like I totally forgot. But I find like I wanted to like talk about like me and you, like for us,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you think about like you said, like the guys in our group, right? Like so we have
Mm-hmm.
both guys and girls in our friend group, and like for us, like I'll be feeling off, right? And it's like you can't really like tell the world like, oh, or it's not like written on your forehead like, oh, this is happening
Mm-hmm.
to me, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't want to talk about it, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like when something, if you snap at someone, they'll be like, oh, like they don't do this often though. Let me tell you, like I don't know, for myself, they don't do this often to me, but like just like when you snap and you're like, are you on your period? Like, like, are you
Mm-hmm.
PMSing or like, what are you doing? Like, and it's just like, it's so negative. And it's like, dude, like, that just like makes you even angrier and like more
Yeah.
like annoyed because you're
Emotional.
like, can
Yeah.
you stop? Like, can I just be like myself? Like,
Mm-hmm.
just cut it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's really annoying and frustrating sometimes.
Yeah.
Another thing about the anxiety disorder thing, um, I feel like for myself, my anxiety gets worse when I'm on my period. And it's like, that's just like over the years, it's just become something that I know that I'm going to have to deal with. And so I feel like that's what changes the experience for me also.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when I'm so good, like after day one for me, I'm chilling. Like I'm so relaxed and like so
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, it is what it is. Like, see, that's what it is. Like it's just different for everyone. And even like PMSing, like for you to be able to be diagnosed with PMDD, you would have to understand your period cycle. You would have to be able to track it accurately. Then you'd have to track your mood swings, and then you'd have to understand all of these emotions, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
would have to. It's like really complicated, and that's why
Yeah.
it's hard to have like studies and um like accurate results with these things. And even like being diagnosed with something, right? And like maybe you didn't track it properly, or you didn't, like it can lead to different things where it's like you
Irregularities.
don't exactly, where maybe it's not PMDD, maybe there's something even bigger that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's just something that I feel like us as a society need to get better at.
Yeah, for sure. No, I definitely agree. I think that, we need to start taking these kind of things more seriously, because I talk to way too many girls who are suffering from, they're finally like recognizing that birth control is making them depressed and they're getting off birth control. But then they have an onslaught of these, symptoms that they're trying to cope with, because their cycles have been so messed up for so long.
Yeah.
So I think it's super important. Like, I can't stress how incredibly important it is to, you know, understand your body, understand these cycles, because they really are beautiful. And I think that the stigma around them makes us hate them so much. I don't know how many times I've wished that I was a boy. I'm like, this is ridiculous, the amount of crap I have to go
That
through.
was a boy.
Literally all the time. I'm like, oh my goodness, they have it so easy. And yeah, in a sense, like they do, like men struggle with different things, but you know, when we look at it from this perspective, it's like the stigma around it is so heavy that it prevents us from asking for help. And I think that that's the scariest thing of it all.
That's
It's
a
like
problem,
we need
yeah.
to really work towards a world where people are comfortable to go ask for help concerning their periods and concerning menstruation. Like it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I feel like the fear of like, oh, like this is normal, or like, yeah, exactly, the stigma around it just
Yeah,
makes it harder to like take that
for
first
sure.
step, you know? And even like
For
learning
sure.
about it online. Online's scary too. You like fall into a hole of like, I'm dying, like, but you're really not.
And there's so many words, like there's so many big words. Like if you don't understand basic science, like how are you supposed to understand any of this? Like that's
Yeah.
the other thing. It's like we have to be taught at a young age so that we have an adequate understanding of it, because people don't.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but like it was only until first year uni in Doug Richards' like health class, or what was it, like thing health class,
Doug Richards,
that I
personal health.
learned about like periods and every step of the period, like every single thing of the period. And I was fascinated. I was like, whoa, this blew my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
why am I an 18-year-old learning about this like
Yeah.
so
For
many
the
years
first
after?
time.
For the first
Yeah.
time in detail. You know what I'm saying?
Literally.
So
Yeah.
like that speaks a lot to our education system. And I feel like for myself, like I don't, that's like another thing like about my community. Like my education, I feel like was not as great as it could be, because I know like my cousin's school, where they're like kind of from like richer places, they have like these health classes and like way more like programs for females, where they're able to go and learn, where they're able to go and like just have like more opportunities. But yeah, like even like that was fascinating for me, and I was thinking about this through the whole talk, like while we were talking. The only time I learned about my period in detail was when I came to university. Now that is also because I took kinesiology. Imagine if I wanted to go into law, like I would never see this.
Yeah.
Like imagine, just
Crazy.
like it blows my mind.
Boggles my mind. Anyways, that's probably gonna wrap it up for today. And next week on our next episode, we're going to be talking about sports and periods. And I'm actually most excited for this because,
Me as
again,
well.
like it's so relevant, so relevant to
Because
life.
we're both kinesiology kids. Come on now, that's why.
Yeah. And we play like sports and we're both involved in sports. So yeah, we're super excited for that. And we hope to see you back again next week. Take care.
Bye.